Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. We did the chairs like this so you can have a kind of discussion better than being out there in the audience. People on Zoom, if you put your questions in the chat, I'll monitor the chat and we can ask the speaker when she gets done with the presentation. If you're in the room and you have a cell phone, if you could please silence it, would be greatly appreciated. And Danae is going to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you. So today I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Amanda Phalin. Amanda and I go back a number of years. She was the Senate incoming chair-elect, and I ran into her at UF, but she's like, you've got to run for chair. And so she dragged me back into university governance, which I had sworn off, absolutely, but she talked me into it, so she's very persuasive. I believe she's spoken to you all before, but she's a professor in the College of Business, the Warrington College of Business. She got her BA from Vassar. She got an MA in, or was it MS? MA in International Economics from GW and her PhD from UF. And she's going to talk to us about the economy, about the big beautiful bill, about tariffs, and it's going to make all of it make sense because it does not to me. No, you have a
Yes, great. Thank you, Danae. I appreciate it. And thank you all for having me. I'm thrilled to be back with you all. So I'm going to go through some slides and talk a little bit about what's contained in the bill, what some of the expected impacts are, what are some of the positives, what are some of the unknowns, what are some of the negatives. And then afterwards, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. So I'm sure that you all have seen in the news the OBBB, or the Big Beautiful Bill, which was signed on Independence Day. That's a picture of President Trump after he signed the law on the South Lawn of the White House. I feel really bad for all those people because if you have ever been to Washington, D.C. in July, I don't know why they would want to do a signing outside. It is like doing a signing outside here, but they did. All right, so today I want to give you an overview of what's inside the Big Beautiful Bill. First of all, it's almost 1,000 pages long, so I'm invariably going to miss something or some things that you all may be interested in, but I'm pulling out things that I'm highlighting that I think are really important and that really have attracted the most news coverage. And so we're going to go through some of these. Medicaid and SNAP, expansion of the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, or TCJA, cuts to clean energy programs, increases in defense and DHS, or Department of Homeland Security spending, and changes to how student loans work. So let's start off with Medicaid cuts. So the bill has two major components. Is that number one, it's reducing funding that states use to cover folks on Medicaid, and it's also instituting work requirements. So depending upon who you ask, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, or various think tanks around Washington, D.C., the estimate is that between 10 million and 16 million people are going to lose coverage. And that last point there, many people don't know what's coming. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because of what I have on the left of this slide. On the top there, that is the logo for the Florida Medicaid program, which is called the SMMC, Statewide Medicaid Managed Care Program. So some states have the name Medicaid in their state level programs. There are other states, such as Oklahoma, Iowa, Connecticut, or Alaska, that have completely different names for their Medicaid programs. So there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence that folks who are on Sooner Select or have their children on Hawkeye or who have health insurance through Husky Health don't know that their Medicaid is being cut because these programs are not called Medicaid, so they don't think that they're Medicaid. It's very similar to the distinction between the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare. And if you look at polls and you ask people, what do you think of Obamacare? The majority of people hate it. And if you ask people, what do you think of the Affordable Care Act? The majority of people like it. So there's a lot of confusion that is going to result simply because across states, it's not clear to everybody that Medicaid is Medicaid. And this is actually going to be a really interesting moment for a research study that I might do myself. Another area that's being cut pretty significantly is the SNAP program, which is short for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Currently, we spend 100 billion tax dollars a year on the program around the country. Oh, that should be a percent, not a dollar, my bad. So that's about 1.5% of the entire federal budget. To give you an idea of how that compares, 12.9% of our budget goes to defense spending. And then I think like 40% goes to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So there are currently 40 million people who receive various different levels of SNAP coverage. The largest group of people who receive SNAP benefits are children. It's estimated that over 5 million families are going to see their benefits reduced. So it's really interesting to me that we saw a historic decline during the COVID pandemic of childhood poverty and childhood hunger. And part of the reason for that was because of those big stimulus checks that the government just sent out to everybody. I remember I check my bank account every Monday just to see what's been going on. And I opened up my bank account and I was like, oh, I got an extra $285 for my daughter from the US Treasury. That money just literally popped into my account out of nowhere. So that was definitely one of the reasons why we saw that reduction. And since that money has run out, we've seen the rate of poverty and rate of hunger among children rise, and we can expect to see that rise further with further cuts. All right, some other parts of the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act raised the standard deductions, made it taxes on estates and gifts lower, increased the child tax credit, and also increased the SALT limit. And all of these things have been extended and or made permanent. Now, of course, for us here in Florida, the SALT deduction, state and local tax deduction, doesn't really matter for us, right? Because we don't have that state income tax. But it's certainly a boon. If you look at the data, it's going to benefit blue states most. It's going to benefit blue states most because they tend to have the higher tax rates. So I wanted to take a look at tax rates, and you can see that since the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act was passed, we've seen a fall in tax rates for every single tax bracket, from the poorest to the wealthiest. So AGI, that stands for Adjusted Gross Income, FYI. So we've seen everybody's income tax has fallen. Now, if we look at who pays the most tax, we look at who pays the most tax. Our wealthy folks are definitely paying more in income tax. So you might think that this means that wealthy people are really paying more taxes. But what we're going to see is that for extremely wealthy people, particularly these folks, income is really a small portion of their total wealth. And a lot of their income is actually not counted as income that is taxed, but is counted as investments or other holdings that may have more advantageous tax categorization. Generally, If you look at the pot of money that the US government takes in every year, almost half of it comes from income taxes. Almost half of it comes from income taxes. What kind of tax breaks are we getting for individuals? First of all, we're getting the ability to deduct any automobile loans from a car that you buy as long as that car is made in the United States of America. There's also, we heard a lot about this during the campaign, the ability to deduct your tips from your wages. And they added also the ability to deduct pay that you get for overtime, so you don't have to pay the taxes on that. Now, the question here, the devil is in the details. This sounds really good, right? This sounds really, really good. Like if you are a waitress on your feet for 12 hours a day and you make your money mostly from tips, like it's great that you wouldn't have to pay taxes on that. However, how this is going to be implemented depends on what regulations the US Treasury writes to implement this law. So who counts as a tipped worker? What counts as money that is considered to be a tip? And how are those rules going to be enforced? And so there's no doubt that having this is going to be a benefit. The question is how much and how expansive is it going to be? And are we going to see the definition include things like doctors and hedge fund managers? So it depends on how widely they define what a tipped worker is and what constitutes a tip. Another interesting benefit for individuals is that the Big Beautiful Bill Act started something called Trump accounts. So for every baby born in the United States in the next 3 years, they are going to get $1,000 deposited in an account, and their parents are going to be able to deposit up to $5,000 tax-free every year. That sounds really great. However, we already have the ability for parents to invest, and the tax structure is actually more advantageous for what we already have, which is the 529 plans that go for college and education. So this is definitely a benefit. And again, I think it depends on how it's rolled out and how it's explained. But on the downside, if you look at information from the Tax Foundation, taxfoundation.org is a great nonpartisan think tank that looks at these types of analysis. They are very leery of any law or regulation that adds complexity to the tax system. And that's what all of these things do. All right, breaks for business. Breaks for business. Oh, sorry. So the first thing is that it makes what are called pass-through deductions permanent. So pass-through income is basically income from a company that passes through to the company's individual owner and is taxed as their personal income, so that if you are the owner of a sole proprietorship, you don't get double taxed. You don't have to get taxed as your company. You don't have to get taxed as yourself. So there are certain business types that are going to be able to take advantage of this pass-through deduction, which they've set at 20%, sole proprietorships, partnerships, S corporations, and in some cases, LLCs. So for small businesses, this is really important and it provides additional money. However, as an economist, I always look for something that we call perverse incentives. Have we created a policy that is going to unknowingly or unwittingly cause people to behave in a way that is not optimal? So one of the things that pass-through deductions tend to do is it tends to impact the way that people structure their businesses. It tends to make people want to open up and incorporate as an S Corp instead of a C Corp, or as a sole proprietorship instead of an LLC. And so to the extent that it distorts what people would otherwise be doing in a free market, we may start to see issues. Second, I'm very excited about this, very excited about this. The BBB allows companies to write off immediately the total money that they spend on buying equipment and also engaging in research and development. This is really important for a couple of reasons. Number one, because the tax codes around the world already allow this in most places that we're competing with, so we're finally catching up. Previously, you could amortize the write-off over the years and take a little bit at a time. But from the research that I've seen, and I'm very much into innovation and intellectual property. Having these kinds of tax incentives to increase research and development is a really, really good idea for business. So I'm very excited about that, and I'll be really interested to see what the data says about this particular part of the bill in the coming years. The third thing that is pretty big news for businesses is that for large American multinational corporations that are headquartered in the US but have operations around the world, tax breaks that were given in 2017 are extended. And I will note that in terms of the corporate tax rate, I think that there's a lot of complaining on both sides about, well, our corporate tax rates are too high, we're not competitive, or no, our corporate tax rates are too low, we're letting corporations get away with everything. If you look at the corporate tax rates, this corporate income tax rate, the CIT, in the OECD. The OECD is a group of advanced countries. It stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The US corporate income tax is right at the average. So we don't have a corporate income tax that's significantly higher or significantly lower than a lot of our competitors. Another part of the BBB is cuts to clean energy investments that were part of the Inflation Reduction Act, known as the IRA. So under the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed under the Biden administration, individuals, families, and businesses could get tax breaks, tax credits for buying renewable energy systems like solar panels for your home, for buying parts to those systems, for buying parts of electronic vehicles, batteries, and the vehicles themselves. So those have been rolled back. That rollback is not immediate. There are some programs that are staying in effect through 2026, and we'll start to see a rollback later. They're also easing regulations and access to fossil fuel production. However, analyses have shown that because you're removing the access to renewable energy and demand is also spiking for energy at the same time, energy costs are expected to increase anywhere between $175 and $280 a year per household. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the energy sector in the United States, because we hear a lot about how the government subsidizes renewable energy, and the government definitely subsidizes renewable energy. This was a 2022 number, so this number is going to go down. But as of 2022, renewable energy, wind, solar, hydropower, etc., got almost $16 billion in federal government subsidies. Fossil fuels, depending on how you define the subsidy, whether it's a direct or indirect benefit, they are subsidized to the tune of $20 billion to over $500 million. So the problem with subsidies is this. The problem with subsidies is that the government is giving money to make something work. In other words, if they didn't have the money, it wouldn't work themselves. And so a lot of conservatives will say, you know what? The fact that renewable energy can't be sustained on its own in a free market means we shouldn't be spending money on it. And yet, we still spend tens of billions of dollars subsidizing the oil industry as well. And the question for me would be, would the fossil fuel industry be able to survive without the government subsidies? We also spend tens of billions of dollars subsidizing the farm industry every year, which you might think is great. Oh, with Farmer Jane and Farmer Joe in Kansas, we really need to help them out. Well, we're not helping out individual farmers. We're giving billions of dollars to Archer Daniels Midland. We're giving money to huge agricultural conglomerates. So from an economic perspective, I am not a fan of subsidies because they distort these signals from the free market. Now, here's the caveat to that. Every other country in the world subsidizes everything and everyone. So if we, the United States, were to say, well, we're not going to subsidize our fossil fuel, we're not going to subsidize our farmers anymore, do you think Europe's going to stop subsidizing them? Nope. You think China is? Oh, no. Japan? No. So we are in sort of a global subsidy race to the top, because as long as our trade partners are subsidizing all of these different industries, we can't not without putting ourselves at a competitive disadvantage. But from a pure economic free market perspective, subsidies are a distortion, and they reduce overall welfare and output. All right, a couple of changes for student loans. There's basically caps on how much you can borrow, and also a lifetime borrowing limit. Also reduces the ease with which you can repay your loans. There was a huge sort of loan suspension under the Biden administration that's being rolled back. One thing that's been added in the bill is an increased access to Pell Grants. So Pell Grants are the federal grants that are available to low-income students to make sure that they can access university education as well. And here in Florida, that's one of our key performance indicators is the 6-year graduation rate of our Pell students. And they're doing very well, so we're very excited about that. All right, so there are some funds that are being increased. DHS, which oversees both immigration, customs enforcement, and customs and border protection, they're getting a lot more money for the immigrant roundups and detentions, as well as for the construction of the wall in the southern part of the country. We're also seeing a big increase in defense spending for lots of different projects. Now, this is something, when I teach this to my class, or I tell people who are conservative about this, they just get really mad at me. But I'm going to tell you that this is like, I can't change these facts. Okay? So the debt limit is basically how much money we're allowed to have in debt, and the Congress has to raise that limit every year. And what has happened since President Obama was elected in 2008, well, it started in 2011. Since 2011, Republicans have refused to raise the debt limit when a Democrat is in the White House, and they have raised the debt limit every time a Republican is in the White House. So what happens with all of these debt limit standoffs is that it means that the confidence that the global marketplace has in the US's ability to pay their debts becomes politicized. And that is partly the reason why in the last 2 years, we've seen Moody's, Fitch, and S&P lower our credit rating from the best to the second best. Now, why do I say that this GOP lack of willingness to raise the debt limit is partly to blame? The other reason why our debt rating was lowered is because we have so much debt. Those two things work in tandem together, okay? If we didn't have a dysfunctional political environment, the fact that we have so much debt wouldn't matter. We didn't have so much debt, we could have a dysfunctional political environment and it wouldn't matter. But you can't have both of those things together. And so if you're a Republican, you're going to say, oh, tax and spend Democrats, they're the ones responsible for this. If you're a Democrat, you're going to say, listen, they love to spend money when their guys are at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. They love it. Run up the deficit if we've got a Republican in the White House. But if it's us, no way. And they're both right. They're both right. So let's look at some of the potential impacts. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, estimates that our deficit is going to be increased by about $3.5 trillion over the next 10 years. And just in case you guys don't know, there is an important distinction between the deficit and the debt. The deficit is the money that we are short of on an annual basis. The debt is all of our deficits added up. So when you hear about the national debt, that's everything that we've gone in the hole for from 1776 to now, whereas our deficit just refers to what's happening in a particular year. One thing that's really going to help us answer this question of whether the big beautiful bill is going to be a good thing is by looking at the 2017 bill. Because a lot of what's in the big beautiful bill was passed already in 2017, and we've had these policies. So when we look back at the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, did all of these pass-through breaks, corporate tax breaks, et cetera, did they lead to higher wages and did they lead to higher growth? I'm going to give you an answer that you guys are going to hate. And the answer is we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because there was this thing that happened right around the same time that the law really would have gone into effect, which is called COVID. And so you had COVID happen and the government expenditure response to COVID, which happened at the end of the last Trump administration and the beginning of the next Biden administration. And so it has been really difficult for economists to untangle those impacts. So it's really hard to say how effective some of those policies have been. Now, I will tell you where you can go look to get differing perspectives. Because what happens is you have liberal think tanks that are focusing on certain data, and it's horrible, and they're right. And you have conservative think tanks that are focusing on other data points, and they're great, and they're right. And so the question is, how does it all net out? I haven't had time to figure that out yet. But I will tell you, if you want the liberal, oh my God, this is terrible take, you want to visit the Center for American Progress. If you want the conservative, this is fantastic take, you want to visit the Heritage Foundation. If you want the conservative, moderate take, you want to visit AEI.org, which is the American Enterprise Institute, or the Brookings Institution. AEI is center right. Brookings Institution is center left. So there's our whole spectrum from very right, Heritage, AEI center right, Brookings center left, Center for American Progress all the way to the left. Ultimately, the outcome and the impacts on the economy are going to depend on a couple of things that Trump does or doesn't do. The defining phrase of the Trump administration 2.0 has been and looks to be uncertainty. Uncertainty. Policies with regards to tariffs, have been, in some cases, changing on an hourly, not even daily, but hourly basis. It is very hard for our trade partners and for businesses to make medium and long-term investment decisions and planning decisions in that environment. So the uncertainty that has been engendered by the policy changes cannot be understated. Tariffs are also going to really impact the economy. Quarter 2, we saw negative GDP growth of 0.5%. The first estimate for third quarter growth comes out on July 31st. Okay, so on August 1st, we should know whether or not we have a Trump recession or not. The definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. So we've had 1 quarter, and I should note that when the first estimate for the second quarter came out, the negative growth estimate was negative 0.3. Once more data came in, they revised that estimate downward to negative 0.5. Now, unfortunately, all of the headlines are usually going to the first estimate, but I tend to watch the second and third one a little bit more. Just a quick question for you guys. How many of you guys trust the statistics that come out from the federal US government? GDP, unemployment. Okay. So what tends to happen is that folks trust the numbers depending upon their political party. So if a Democrat is in the White House and you're a Democrat, you're going to trust the numbers, and a Republican will distrust, and vice versa. But I'm here to tell you that that attitude is wrong. I'm here to tell you that that attitude is wrong. And the reason it's wrong, you can trust the numbers that come out. And I will tell you why. It's because all of the data that are used to calculate those top line numbers are publicly available. And there are thousands of economists around the country and around the world looking at that data. And if something were amiss, boy, we would hear about it. So what would concern me is if the July 31st release of GDP is delayed for any reason, or if there is a lack of transparency in sharing the data. If those two things start to happen, regardless of who's in the White House, then I get concerned. Let me give you an example of a country whose data you should not trust, because actually we don't have their data, and that's China. Oh, we grew 5% last year. Oh, really? Can we have the it's 5%? Well, what about the it's 5%? They are a black box. And in fact, there are other ways to estimate economic growth, one of them using satellite imagery and looking at lighting and electricity used. And China might actually be in a recession now. So I always like to reassure people that you can definitely, absolutely depend on the numbers that are coming out because of the transparency built into our system. And I hope that transparency doesn't ever get pushed to the wayside. Another really important factor is whether the Federal Reserve, which controls our money supply and the interest rates, manages to stay independent of political influence. If you look back in history, anytime you have had politicians involved in the money supply or setting the interest rates, it has been a disaster. A very recent example is Turkey. So independence of the Federal Reserve is really important. And then the last thing I will say is that if COVID taught us anything, there are things that are going to happen that we can't even imagine or conceive of. So you all may remember during the Iraq War that then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld talked about the unknown unknowns. There's known unknowns, but we are in an era of multiple unknown unknowns. And I really have no idea what may be bubbling up under the surface in terms of another pandemic, in terms of another crash in another sector of the market, in terms of an environmental disaster. There are so many unknown unknowns. So I'll leave it on that note and take any questions that you all may have. Thank you.
Danae and I are going to assist with questions, and we have given such a wonderful turnout today. We're going to handle it this way. That side of the aisle, Danae is going to take one question. I'm going to do the same over here. We're going to attempt also to have opportunities for our participants who are online. And so please understand, we're attempting to have everyone who's here who wants to ask a question or discussion have at least one opportunity. So with that in mind, who do we have first on this side? Sir.
Well, my question is this. The dollar is the world's currency. What happens economically in the United States if we lose that status? What would happen to our economy? What are the implications? And which currency do you think would take over?
So remember how I talked about the fact that our debt isn't a big problem? The reason it's not a big problem is precisely because we are the world's preeminent currency. We are the world's reserve currency. For countries that don't have that standing, having a huge debt is a disaster. Look at Greece. So if we lose our standing as the world's reserve currency, which is not likely, but it is possible, then our debtors are going to come calling really, really quickly, and things are going to get really bad really, really fast. If that were to happen, I think the euro would be the euro, or a combination of the euro, the yen, and the pound. There's been a lot of talk about the Chinese yuan, but they're just nowhere near placed or with the infrastructure or the political, economic, or cultural influence to take over for the dollar right now. That is something I worry about.
Hi, I'm Dave Wilson. I don't know if you've mentioned this already because I came in a few minutes late. The tax on Social Security. And I understand Donald Trump wanted to cut that, and that didn't happen, but there's a new deduction.
Yes, there is a new deduction. I did mention that. I did mention that in the slides. Yes, that is part of the big beautiful bill that will impact all of you.
Yeah, an observation on the Trump baby accounts, that it seems that those families that can't afford the $5,000 each year are severely disadvantaged compared to those who can. So already it creates some problems between the rich and the poor. Secondly, do you have any insight into how the BBB affects the progressiveness of the tax system, or who actually pays for most of the government budget, and where does it fall? But it seems like it's changing with this bill.
To your first question, if I were a President Trump advisor, I would say, well, would you rather them not have $1,000 then? Because compounding interest on $1,000 is better than compounding interest on zero, right? So I think that's the argument, that it's better than nothing. As to your second question, I think it depends on how you look at the numbers and who you ask. As I said, 49% of our government's revenue comes from income taxes, and high income earners, 100,000 and above, pay the majority of that. But that also means that there's 50% of our revenue coming from things like corporate income taxes and excise taxes and also tariffs, which, by the way, we pay. We pay them. That's just incorrect to say that the other countries do. So I have not looked, it's a good question. I have not looked at the data to see for the other 50% how that breaks up. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you.
Mhm. Amanda, there are a number of questions online before we go across the aisle.
What are the potential impacts of BRICS? So for those of you who may not be familiar with BRICS, that stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's a group of quickly developing middle income countries. And they have conferences together every couple of years. Their leaders get together. So I don't see any big impacts in the currency markets from any of these countries. In fact, the only country among the BRICS that's doing really well right now is India. All of the other ones are really struggling. The 20 to 760 billion range is huge. Why is it so large? It's so large because there are different ways of counting a subsidy. So whether you count like a tax credit, a tax deduction, or sometimes a regulatory change that saves you money can be counted as a subsidy. So that huge range really depends, is because it depends on your definition of a subsidy. Since tariffs are in actuality an indirect tax on the consumer, what is the anticipated effect on consumer spending and the economy? That's a really good question. The expected effect is inflation, and there's an important reason why we haven't seen that yet. The reason why we haven't seen that inflation yet is because companies knew as early as last summer that Trump was going to be imposing tariffs. He was very clear about that. It's his favorite word, the most beautiful word. And so if you look at shipping lanes and if you look at what's been going in and out of ports where our imports and exports come and go, companies really beefed up their inventory. And so companies have a massive amount of inventory that they've been leaning on so they don't have to raise prices. Secondly, companies have also been, of their own choice, eating into their profit margins. There was just an article in the Wall Street Journal about this today. They've been basically taking those cost increases themselves because they view that as the lesser evil of raising prices. Now, that ability to reduce profit margins and the ability to rely on your inventory, that's running out. And as we get into back to school season, we get into pumpkin latte, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Hanukkah season, we are really going to start to see some price crunches. The other thing that I will note that is a really important factor right now that you all may not have heard of is something called cheapflation. Has anybody heard of cheapflation? Here, I'm going to wait until that phone turns off. I think some. Oh my goodness. Okay, you guys are very popular. I don't even get these phone calls. My goodness. Okay, so cheapflation refers to the phenomenon that's happening right now where the price of goods that are going up the most are goods that are bought by lower income people. So your basic food stuff, your basic day-to-day stuff, that's where you're really starting to see the price increases. And so that's why so many people before the election were like, oh my God, eggs, groceries, milk. So there are certain sectors of the economy where you can really see price explosions. And there are other sectors where it's really kind of flat.
Okay. If we have a very negative report at July 31st, what, if any, is the antidote?
I mean, stop the tariffs, stop the uncertainty, but that's not going to happen.
So nothing, basically.
Correct. I don't foresee President Trump reversing course on that.
And then how long does that negative situation last?
That depends upon what happens with the inflationary increases that we're going to start to see when the inventory falls and when people start shopping for back to school and the holidays. That's a wait and see. Might want to buy your Christmas presents now.
Now, I assume you believe in the Council of Economic Advisors analysis in general. Are they objective?
The President's Council of Economic
Council of
Advisors.
Economic Advisors.
I believe that's what Kevin Hassett. No, there are some economists on there that have.
Okay.
Yeah. No.
Well, it's interesting to note that their analysis is that if the BBB had not been passed, the average taxpayer would have had a 22% tax increase. The average family of 4 would be paying $1,700 more, child tax credit reduced by 50%. And they went through a number of predictions of what would happen if it did pass. So I think you need to be balanced about that. When we're talking about cuts to Medicaid or SNAP, it's instructive to note that the vast majority of the are based upon work requirements, which some are describing as savage, draconian, heartless. Facts matter. The requirements indicate that somebody between the ages of able-bodied people between 19 and 64 who don't have a dependent child under the age of 14 have to either work, volunteer, or go to school for 20 hours a week.
Did you have a question, sir, that I can answer for you?
And describing that, the question would be this. No, I don't. I just have real questions with your assumptions.
So if
Thank
you remember, 2 of the slides that I had talked about the fact that taxes have gone down, income taxes have gone down for every tax bracket. So, and I also talked about the fact that there is the increase in the child income tax credit. So I've presented both the cuts and the other side. Question over here.
I guess my question involves maybe some details that may not be available, but regarding well, for one thing, I get some tax newsletters, and I was told that there is no change to the taxability of Social Security. Even though that was hemmed and hawed about, it is not in there.
I would need to go back to the slide where I have the information about the Social Security.
But I did also have a question regarding the taxability of tips and overtime, because my impression is that they want to not pay income tax, but then what about Social Security tax, Medicare tax? Because what you pay into Social Security affects what your benefits will be when you reach retirement age. And these people are they're kind of being gypped because they're not contributing to their future benefits.
So
If that's
this is my fault. I actually left out the slide that I thought I had about the Social Security, but it does. So there is an expansion. They're calling it the senior bonus. So there is an expansion that allows people, in some cases over 65, in some cases over 75, to deduct more than they could in the past.
But it's a deduction. It's not a change to the
Correct.
taxation.
It's a deduction change. It's not a change in like a tax credit. It's not direct money to you.
But do you know whether tips and overtime will still be subject to what's called employment tax?
I think that is going to depend on, again, how the U.S. Treasury Department writes the rules implementing that law. There are so many unknowns there.
That's a big one.
President Trump claimed a national emergency, a threat to our security because of we're getting ripped off, quote unquote, by other countries via the balance of trade. Would you discuss this and explain it?
Right. So that's really not the case. There are two numbers that you need to look at. And one number that looks really bad for us is called the trade deficit. And that's where you have exports minus imports. So we're importing a lot more than we're exporting. That's the trade deficit. Okay. The number that is more instructive is what I call the trade ratio, where you look at the ratio of exports to imports, the exports to imports. And in 1999, our overall trade ratio was we imported 60% of our trade and we exported 40% of our trade. That was in 1999. So 100% international trade, 60% of our trade is imports, 40% of our trade is exports. What do you guys think the trade ratio has become in 2019? That's the last time the data are available. It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same. So when people talk about the trade deficit ballooning, it is ballooning. But you know what else is ballooning? Our exports. Are we buying a lot of stuff from China? Yep, but they are also buying more from us than they ever have before. In fact, if you look at the US to China trade ratio, it's improved. We're exporting more to China than we were in 1999.
Do the figures include services?
Yes, the figures include services. So, in fact, when you look at services alone, we have a massive trade surplus because that's what our economy is good at. Our trade deficit is driven by tangible goods. It's driven by goods. We do not have an economy that specializes in manufacturing. And some people will say, well, we need to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Well, two things. Number one, that's not what our population is good at. Number two, last month, The Economist did a really great survey, and they asked Americans, do you think more Americans should work in factories? 80% of them said yes. The second question they asked was, would you be willing to work in a factory? 80% of them said no. So we have this idea that we need to be self-sufficient and make our own stuff, but guess what? Ain't nobody gonna do it.
Have you seen the state's response to the bill? Specifically, Medicaid in Florida pays for more than half of the people in nursing homes. What's going to happen when that money gets cut off? What's going to happen to those people, to those nursing homes? Are the states responding at all to this yet? Because they don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot, but as far as what's going to happen, call Governor DeSantis and maybe Byron Donalds or whoever's or Casey DeSantis, whoever's going to be the next governor. They're going to deal with it.
Regardless of where you fall on tariffs, the latest deal with Japan has a 25% rate on their car exports to the U.S. And the U.S. auto industry is claiming they're being disadvantaged because of the imported parts, which they import from elsewhere. And of course, Canada's rate is higher. Can you explain what the rationale might be for that?
The rationale for imposing those tariffs?
For having what appears to be a better deal for Japan than winds up with the U.S. manufacturers.
Yeah, what's the rationale? That's actually a big part of the problem with Trump's trade policy is the lack of consistency. Okay? What Trump did was essentially tear up our trade relationship, which we had under the World Trade Organization. We had sort of these common tariffs. And now we're having to go back and negotiate individually. That is extremely inefficient. And it also gives countries and companies the opportunity to get around bilateral trade agreements by going through other countries. So to your point, why does Japan get a better deal? You know, a lot of what happens depends upon leaders' personal relationships with Trump. And that's another reason why the Trump trade policy is so inefficient, because it's not always based on what the market is signaling. It's based on who Trump is having a good relationship with that week, who he's happy with, who he's not happy with. That is not the way to formulate and implement policy, regardless of who you are in the White House.
My name is Stuart Bisevsky. The question I have, you presented all the facts in a very clear way, and I applaud you on that. Behind all of this are the choices that have been made. We talk on the one hand about the reductions in Medicaid, and we see the reductions in taxes for certain elements of society. The choices being made in terms of what we might call fairness. What is behind all of that? We see that work requirements may be imposed upon people in order to get Medicaid. The work requirements don't bother me so much as the paperwork that people might have to fill out to prove it. And a lot of people who are actually working won't do the paperwork. You're increasing the deficit for what purpose? We see visually the choices being made. There are winners and there are losers, and the outcome and the ultimate outcome for the economy in general is a great unknown. We do know that there are going to be losers. There will be winners. So given all of this, what is your take, for example, on the policies being put forward? Are they reasonable? Are they unreasonable?
I mean, that's a huge question. It's a loaded question. And actually, Danae, I would think that your wife, Kendall, would be able to better answer that question, given her area of expertise in sociology, than I could. All I can say is that there are a lot of unknowns. We're going to know a lot more about Trumponomics on July 31st. Let's see what's happened. And as I showed in the presentation, there are parts of the bill, like the R&D write-offs, that I really, really like. And there are parts of the bill that I don't think are advisable and could distort markets, like the pass-through deduction. So your question is like, what is my political philosophy? Like, why do I think Republicans and Democrats do anything? Maybe we can all have a drink sometime, and 3 wines in, I'll tell you, but that's not, you know what I mean?
You have a question upon the, I think the fourth one.
Oh, and there's another one. It says one new. Okay.
That's the one.
Oh, please comment on the fact that international trade and services is counted in the trade deficit or trade ratios, but tariffs by the president are not imposed on trade and services, only on goods like cars. Yeah, that's another problem. And that's another reason why the Trump trade policy is so malformed, because it only focuses on trade and goods. And trade and services is really where we shine. There is one slice of trade and goods where we're really good, and that's really high-tech advanced manufacturing. And so interestingly, the Big Beautiful Bill Act gives tax incentives and breaks for companies that are making those advanced semiconductor chips, which is exactly the same policy that President Biden passed, right? So, hey, something we can all agree on. So there are some areas in the goods part of the trade deficit where we are at an advantage, but services is most definitely where we shine.
Trump has touted tariffs as a way where we're going to get rich. We're going to make a lot of money. Okay, as an academic economist, would you characterize tariffs as a direct tax on consumers? And if not, why?
Yes, it's a direct tax. The only question is, how much of a tax is it? So I'm going to get, well, no, I don't want to get that technical on you, but essentially, if a company can raise the price on you, they will. If a company can raise the price on you and the demand for their product will stay about the same, they will raise the price. In some cases, if a company raises a price by a lot, people say, oh, well, F you, I'm not buying that anymore. And so they have to keep the price low. I'll give you two like extreme examples, okay? The EpiPen and my daughter's asthma inhaler. Every time I go to Publix, ma'am, are you aware that this inhaler costs $250? Yes. Are you aware that my 12-year-old needs to breathe? Right? So they can really raise that price. Now let's take a look at like Hershey's. Let's say that Hershey's decides to make all of their products a minimum $100. I like chocolate, but I can give it up. So how much of the increase that they are seeing when they import with tariffs, how much of that they can pass on depends upon how much price increases their end consumers can take. And if you are a Procter & Gamble, if you're Nissan, have you guys seen those Nissan commercials? We're committed to keeping the prices of our cars low despite tariffs. That's because their marketing department looked at what would happen if they passed on those costs. And they were like, oh, crap, we can't do that. But as I mentioned, and as the Wall Street Journal mentioned today, those profit margins for large corporations are shrinking and shrinking. And they're going to come to a point where they're going to have to either eat more or make us eat less. So are we making ourselves rich? No, we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. We're playing duck, duck, goose with American dollars. We're taxing ourselves, which, by the way, is just so funny and ironic to me because normally conservatives do not cheer for tax increases. But they are. They are.
Well, thank you for your discussion and the great talk. My question is, when you're calculating the trade deficit, either with or without services, how is foreign investment counted? In other words, that $500+ billion deal from the Japanese to invest in the United States.
That is completely different. That is so there's the trade balance and then there's the capital investment balance. And they're two.
Well, but okay, what's the net of the capital investment in that case between
Zero.
foreign investment here and our investment elsewhere?
Yeah, that is very volatile from year to year, the net investment. So there's this question about whether the tariffs are going to attract foreign investment. And the answer is we've gotten pledges and commitments from NVIDIA, Apple, and other big companies saying, hey, we are going to build factories here. Okay, that takes like 5 to 7 years to actually come to fruition. So a pledge that is a good PR stunt and puts you in good standing with the Trump administration is very easy to do. Are they actually going to build factories here? I doubt it. I doubt it. If you look at factories that were built here after the last round of tariffs were imposed during the first Trump administration, so he imposed tariffs 2017, 2018, Kia and one other car company built a factory the next year. So everyone's like, oh, there you go. But actually, that company had been planning to build those since 2014 and 2016, respectively. So a lot of this manufacturing attracting that takes place doesn't happen because of short-term economic policy changes. It happens because there is a long-term environment of sustainability and stability that allows companies to be closer to their consumers. So if we look back, when is a time when tariffs corresponded with investments in American manufacturing? The 1980s under President Reagan. Tons of tariffs for Japanese car and motorcycle makers, tons of tariffs. Car prices rose a lot, like $1,200 on average in the 1980s because of those tariffs. And at that time, there was a ton of investment. Japan started moving their factories here. So you might be tempted to say, oh, look what those Reagan tariffs did. They brought over all this manufacturing. Well, we have to remember there are multiple things happening in the world at a time. The other thing that was happening at that time is that Japan was expanding its market in the United States. Number two, there were fast advances in technology and automation that made production cheaper. So did the tariffs help? Sure. But what really made investment possible for Japanese car companies in the 1980s is just-in-time production and automation and the expanding market, because then monetarily it made sense for them to produce over here and be close to their customers and drive their product down the road rather than put it on a ship.
I'm going to ask, we've got about 10 minutes left, and we'll try to do one more from each side at least, and I'm sure the opportunity to stay over. I want to take privilege to ask one quick question. The concern policy stated in the child tax credit is we are not having enough children born in the United States. Economically, how do you provide that incentive? I was bowled over listening to NPR yesterday that an economist said, for if someone today, most of us are baby boomers, I think, if I might, don't want to judge too prematurely, to do what we did for our children, for millennials, it would take someone from birth to progressing to buying cars, to buying a house, to, continue on to their retirement, till their death. It would take $4 million today. How do you provide incentive in that environment?
So conservatives are not going to like this answer, but one of the reasons why our low birth rate hasn't been a problem is because we have a lot of immigrants that come to this country and work and pay taxes and contribute to economic growth. So we don't necessarily have to encourage more American women to have babies. But if you want to, and in fact, if you look at Japan, one of the reasons why they have had such slow growth is because of their very, very tight immigration laws. They started relaxing them pre-COVID, relaxed them even further post-COVID, and it's really been a boon to their labor market and to their economy. So, yeah.
I've got a question. Somebody. You analyzed this tax bill, and thank you very much for that. Could you tell me about other tax bills that have been passed, let's say in the last 30 or 40 years, that you felt were better than this, or would differ? I mean, what differentiates this one from other ones? It always seems to be winners and losers to every tax bill. And so I was just wondering what your feeling is on some of the other tax bills and what they've done, and did they always come out to be as bad or as good as many people thought they were?
But nothing is ever as bad or as good as we think
Right.
it's going to be. As I said at the end of my talk, there are unknown unknowns, and we just don't know yet. As I've said before, there are things in this bill that I like a lot. There are things that I think are really bad. How that is going to net out in the end, maybe I'll come back next year or the year after we've seen some data, and I'll be able to tell you. Okay.
just said, what's that gonna do with international trade? Okay. Okay.
All right, so crypto currently does not have the adoption or the infrastructure to make it a safe, sustainable investment. That doesn't mean that can you dabble in it? Sure. But it's not something that I would move all of my stuff to crypto. It's still very much in its infancy. And I think that we've seen enough scandals in terms of, folks absconding with millions of dollars. There's the lack of oversight is supposed to be an advantage, but it's not always an advantage. So I'm not comfortable there with crypto yet in terms of the infrastructure that undergirds it.
So my question is, I think that the blue collar workers the last 60 years have kind of gotten a raw deal. Okay. So I understand the tariff idea, but we already know we're not going to make more t-shirts or grow more bananas. And we know Germany, who has a lot of manufacturing, only has 13%. So we're not going to get much out of these tariffs. Very little for blue collar workers. There's going to be 2 guys running the robots. So the question is, what options are there to help, I guess, service workers or whoever is making $15 an hour now that used to make 30 or 40 at, making a washing machine?
I think that the answer that I would have had to that question even 6 months ago is different than the answer that I have now, and that's because the lightning speed advances in artificial intelligence. And in the same way that we've seen robots take over blue-collar jobs, I think we're going to start to see AI take over my job of explaining things to you all, or grading things, or that happens to some extent. That is an existential question for this country and for any developed country. And I have some nebulous thoughts and ideas, but I don't know. Those nebulous thoughts and ideas, I don't know. I'm not ready to share those yet.
All right. Well, I want to thank Amanda for coming. I learned a lot. And I'm sure she's willing to chat with you for a few more minutes.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.